see this later. The third prompt is about the doctor. So basically we have the Hmong perspective, we have the caste perspective, and then the third prompt is thinking about the doctor's perspective. And the question is what we were asking last time, right? So after we finish reading the book, we'll know kind of the whole story, and we can use hindsight to reassess the situation. Was this the right thing to do? Were Leah's doctors justified in having Leah placed under the care of Child Protective Services? So anyways, this is the final paper. It's not due for 13 days and 11 hours, so you have plenty of time to think about it, to work on it. I recommend finishing the book first. You could start answering this one, but again, unless you finished the reading, you probably can't start writing even this one. So my advice would be to hold off for now. And of course, there's the forum post due tonight, right? So this is just one paragraph. I see Brendan's already written it. He's in the other section. But anyway, so yeah, Spirit catches you and you fall down versus Radio Lab, and we will talk about Radio Lab today. So any questions about all that stuff? I just described many things to you. Forum post, final paper, any questions about things? All good? All good. And again, we can talk more about the final paper next time. I just wanted to bring it to your attention that it is now online, but for today, forum post is due tonight. Focus on that for tonight. And yeah, we're going to compare the Radio Lab episode to the book we've been reading. If there are no questions, and obviously if you have questions, feel free to type them here. But if there are no questions, let's take it away. So speaking of taking away, Leah was taken away from her family, right? Because her parents did not comply. I think this word is important, right? Comply, compliance. And there was an official document. I could find it for you, but I think we talked about it enough last time, where it was basically like the official petition to the court saying that the parents were not complying with the orders of Leah's doctors, and so she had to be taken away. Eventually, she was returned home. There's a new prescription, Depakine, and it was easier for her parents to measure that out, remember? And also, there was a social worker who came to work with the family and kind of help them comply with the orders of the doctor. And so what we end up with is sort of an interesting question. We didn't quite put it in these terms, but as I was preparing for class, I was thinking about this idea of blame. The parents were being blamed, right? Would you guys agree with that statement? Yeah. What did the courts and doctors blame on the parents? What was the blame? Yeah, please. Water fountains are going to be hard to find, but go to the basement. There's like a place you can buy a drink. Okay, yeah, whatever you need to do. Okay, so now you guys have my undivided attention again. So what did the courts and the doctors blame on the parents? Why did they take these legal actions? Let's think about blame here. Did they blame the parents for Leah's seizures? Did they blame the parents for Leah's seizures? Yeah, exactly. So Yaya's got it. They blamed them for not giving the medicines to the kid. They didn't and can't blame the parents for Leah's seizures, right? Whose fault is it that Leah is having seizures? Yeah, so Harrison's bringing up the question, could the parents actually administer this medicine? And the answer is maybe not, right? Part of it is they're unwilling, but part of it is they're unable. And so it feels like a punishment in a way, although, of course, from the perspective of the courts and the doctors, that's not what it was, right? They want to get the care for the child. So this question of blame is sort of an interesting one, right? It's no, of course, maybe this is more rhetorical than anything else, but no one is to blame for the seizures, right? That's something that just sort of happened, and there's nothing we can really, nothing she or anybody else could really do about it. We could give this medicine, but it's also important to recognize that the medicines can only do so much. And so as we read the last chapter, the big one, right? And this is something we can return to at the end. We find that even when she is given enough medicine, and the parents eventually do sort of learn to comply, and she is given enough medicine, even with the medicine, she still has a big seizure, right? So it's kind of an interesting question. This is the hindsight that you guys can write about, is even when they do comply, even when the parents do comply, she still has the big seizure, right? And so what is even accomplished by taking this child away? It is sort of worth thinking about as we look in retrospect. So this is just a little summary of what we talked about last time. Again, if you want to write about this, you can. The details are a little confusing, but hopefully this slide helps you figure it out, right? She was taken away because she didn't get the medicines that she needed. The parents, like Harrison said, it's a little unclear. Were they unwilling? Were they unable? It's a little bit of both. The courts take her away. She lives with a foster family. And then eventually they come up with a new plan where they're helped to administer the medicines to protect Leah. Okay, questions about this? Again, this is just a little review. And what I really want to do is get to the Radiolab episode. But maybe one last thing to point out, and this should be clear by this point, is that the Lees were very invested in Leah's health, right? This question of neglect or abuse, we talked about that last time, right? The fact that they were not complying with the doctor's orders might look like a form of neglect, and from a certain perspective, it is a form of neglect. So I don't mean to discount that point, but at the same time, they were very much invested in their daughter's health. It was just not in compliance with the doctor's orders, right? And so how did they try to take care of their daughter? Well, they tried a whole bunch of stuff, really interesting things. So page 111, I cite here. You get this whole list of all the interesting things that the parents tried to do to kind of help Leah be healthy. So on 111, unbeknownst to their doctors, the Hmong actually took their children's health so seriously that they frequently budgeted large fractions of their public assistance stipends or indebted themselves to relatives in order to pay for expensive services not covered by Medi-Cal, and that's the kind of public health insurance that they were able to receive. For example, the Lees spent $1,000 on amulets filled with sacred healing herbs from Thailand, which Leah wore constantly around her neck. They also tried a host of less costly but time-consuming therapies. Four inserted a silver coin that said 1936 Indochine Francais into Indochine Francais into the yolk of a boiled egg, wrapped the egg in a cloth and rubbed Leah's body with it. When the egg turned black, that meant the sickness had been absorbed. She massaged Leah with the bowl of a spoon. She sucked the pressure out of Leah's body by pressing a small cup heated with ashes against her skin, creating a temporary vacuum as the oxygen-depleted air inside the cup cooled. She pinched Leah to draw out noxious winds. She dosed Leah with tisanes infused with the gleanings of her parking lot herb garden. Finally, she and Nalcow tried changing Leah's name to Ko, a last-ditch Hmong remedy based on the premise that if a patient is called by a new name, the dub, right, the spirit that stole her soul, will be tricked into thinking that she is someone else and the soul can return. According to Foa, this plan was foiled because Leah's doctors persisted in calling her Leah, thus ruining the subterfuge. So that was a long paragraph, but it helps give you a sense of what the parents were willing to do in order to try to help protect and heal their daughter. Have you guys heard of any of these sort of treatments? Yeah, cupping. Where have you heard of cupping before? Mm-hmm. Acupuncture, is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. Yeah, so they didn't say acupuncture, but this is one kind of related remedy. We were just talking about cupping. We might get some weird images here, but has anybody ever done this before? Have you guys ever seen these sort of bruises on people? They're a little weird looking. Treatment for soreness and pain. Yeah, I think it really became famous with Michael Phelps. Or at least that's when I first started to pay attention to it. These are some pretty weird bruises, right? Well, I guess first of all, do you guys know who Michael Phelps is? He was very famous like 10 years ago. I don't know if he's still famous anymore. Michael Phelps, anyone? Obviously, he's a swimmer. Why is he a famous swimmer? Olympic swimmer? Yeah, he won a ton of gold medals. Was somebody about to say something? I feel like I cut someone off.
Yeah, I said he was the best.
He was the best. Yeah, he's like one of the most decorated Olympians in Olympic history. I think he has the most. I want to say in 2008 he won the most gold medals in Olympic history. And so, anyways, yeah, when he started to do this, I think it caught people's attention. And somebody just wrote, yeah, soreness and pain. I think some NBA players do this, right? It's become a pretty common practice, but none of you guys have done it before, right?
I've done it.
You've done it. What does it feel like, Mario?
I don't know. It feels like exactly what you'd think it'd feel like. It's just like sucking.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It sucks.
It does relieve the soreness though. I've had it on my back.
Okay.
I only did it because my friend was doing it though. He plays baseball.
I see. And so maybe his arm was tight or something like that, and he wanted to
yeah, they did it. He was doing it in like the back of his shoulder and stuff. So I was like, I want to try that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And that's clearly what Phelps is doing too. And so, yeah, when this book was written in the 90s, it was a pretty exotic idea, actually. And I think when the people reading this back in the 90s were reading this, they were probably thinking, oh, that's a bizarre thing to do. Again, it's creating a temporary vacuum as the oxygen-depleted air inside the cup cools, and so it pulls on your skin. And the theory behind it is actually a lot like bloodletting, right? We maybe are not so familiar with that idea, bloodletting, but it's a very old kind of practice. And in fact, sometimes these cups are applied when the skin has been cut and it pulls the blood out rather than just creating a bruise, which, for me, I'd prefer this than have the blood be pulled out, call me squeamish or something like that. But again, the theory is very similar. The theory behind it is there's some sort of blockage in your chi. Have you guys heard of chi before? QI, chi. So it's just like your energy or something like that. Or there's a stagnation in your blood, right? There's some sort of bad stagnant blood, which is, of course, a very old way of thinking. This is not like what a modern medical scientist would say about your blood. They'd say there is no such thing as stagnant blood, or at least not unless you have a bruise or something. And so what the theory here is, though, is that it pulls the bad blood out, right? It just like Fola was trying to suck out, she sucked the pressure out of Leah's body. And so the idea is they're pulling out sort of the bad sickness and leaving the person healthy. Of course, that's not how Michael Phelps would describe it. That's not how Mario described it. But it's the same practice, right? And so it's sort of an interesting moment where there's not a strong scientific basis for this, but just because it works, because it does something, right? It makes you feel something. It's become somewhat popular for athletes. So this is how, maybe let's call it unorthodox treatments might enter into more mainstream society. This is a similar kind of treatment. It looks like it would hurt like hell, right? But I've never done it before, but I've been told that it actually doesn't hurt very much. Similar concept is to rub a coin or a spoon, right? A silver coin or spoon on somebody's body to try to allow the blood and energy to circulate as a result. So this is what the parents were doing. It's just the doctors didn't realize that this is what they were doing. And then they also took Leah to Minnesota. And of course, I already wrote this for you, but Minnesota is not close to California, right? I know we're all on the East Coast here, but you guys are aware of this, right? Like from central Southern California up to Minnesota, that is a crazy long trip, 2,000 miles. That takes many, many days of driving, right? If you, let's say 100 miles an hour or so. No, is that right? Yeah, if you're going like 70, then maybe you can cover 100, maybe a little bit less, 80, 90 miles an hour. So this is, 20 hours of driving. And you know that they're driving, right? They didn't fly there. So this is a major trip. Why did they do it? Is to see this famous shaman in Minnesota again for their daughter. So anyways, why do I emphasize this so much? It just shows when this daughter was taken away, there was this sense of neglect or abuse. These are not abusive parents, right? These are parents who really care for their daughter. It's just the way that they're caring for her is a little bit different than what, or actually very different than what the doctor's orders were. Now Cal and Foa kind of reflect on this. They talk about a little medicine and a little neeb, right? Or a little nung, I think is the way it's pronounced. A little medicine and a little nung. And that's what they wanted to do. They thought too much medicine gives you the weird side effects. Let's give them a little medicine, a little bit of this other stuff, a little bit of medicine. And they felt like that was a good solution. But again, of course, the courts were not into that. So I just wanted to point that out. If you did want to write about this section, these are also some pieces of information you could tie into your argument. Questions about this part? Of course, I do want to get to the radio show, which will be the next topic. So let's keep going. We've seen this map before. I just want to remind you, here's Laos, right? Here's Vietnam. The reason that Hmong people are in the United States is because of the Vietnam War, right? I've mentioned this before. You guys remember all this? There was a war in Vietnam. There's something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Laos. There wasn't supposed to be a war there. And so it's been called the Forgotten War or the Quiet War. I think both of those words are used. And so the war in Vietnam was actually, it was give or take a 20-year affair, right? Americans kind of inherited it from the French. There was this rebellion against French colonial rule. Americans wanted to help them, let's say, keep a Western presence in Southeast Asia. Why were Americans so involved in this war? Do you guys know the answer to this? Maybe I'll just put it.
Didn't want communism to spread.
Communism. Yeah, it was all about communism. Exactly. And the same could be said for the Korean War, right? Which is further up here. Here's North and South Korea. Why is there a North and South Korea? It's because Americans fought on the side of the South. And who fought on the side of the North? China, right? So communist China scared the hell out of America, and Americans didn't want communism to spread through into Korea. And same thing in Vietnam. You know, if you look at it, what does North Vietnam share a border with? Again, China, right? So a lot of these wars were almost like proxy wars between the United States and China. So as we see tensions sort of flaring up again now, really in the past few years, between America and China, this is an old story, right? This goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, back to the Vietnam War. So there wasn't supposed to be a war in Laos, right? According to kind of international rules, Laos was neutral. They're on neither side. It was supposed to be between America and their allies in the South versus the North Viet Cong, the communist armies in the North. But of course, this war was dragged into Laos. And who helped the Americans? Well, it was the Hmong. It was this guy, General Vung Pao, and all of his comrades. They helped the Americans fight against the communist armies in the North, right? They were our allies during this war. And they helped us a lot, right? They were very brave. They died at a rate about 10 times as high as that of American soldiers, which is unbelievable, right? Between 10 and 50% of Hmong people died. I'll let that sink in for a second, right? 1 out of 10 is the low estimate. 1 out of 2, right? Me and Lauren are in the room. That means one of us would have died if we were Hmong during this war, right? 1 out of 2 people. in Hmong communities would have died, because of course the war was being fought where they lived, right? The war came to them. Americans were being shipped in from the outside. They were living in these communities. They were living in the battle zone. There was an average one bombing, what is this, how do you pronounce this? Sortie, I don't know. One bombing sortie every 8 minutes for 9 years. Again, what is that statistic? An average bombing 1 minute, one every 8 minutes for 9 years? And I assume this means all day. It's not just like waking hours. Like, this is the most insane amount of bombs dropped in human history, right? We remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki because those were the big bombs, but the sheer mass of bombs being described here is unimaginable. And this still leaves an impact today. Maybe you guys are aware of this, but there are unexploded bombs, landmines all over Laos, Vietnam, that part of the world, that like children are still discovering and getting their legs blown off. It's really horrendous stuff. So incredible amount of bombing happening during this time. Why do I remind you of this? It was very violent all over Laos and Vietnam during this period. And then at the end of the war, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but it was Nixon, right? Nixon was in charge in the early 70s. We just kind of pulled out. We were just like, you know what? Never mind. See you later. We're gonna play nice with China now. So end of the war. Goodbye. And Henry Kissinger, do you guys know who he is? He's an important person to know. Have you guys heard of him before? Politician, diplomat, geopolitical consultant, Secretary of State. So he was the Secretary of State during the Nixon years. This is what he looks like. Is that a familiar face? Have you guys heard of him before? Sharp guy, very important figure in American politics in the late 20th century. And I guess he's still alive. Is that true? Yeah, I guess he is. He's had a very long life. So Henry Kissinger, he has a quote about the American retreat from Laos. He says, he's talking about the Prime Minister of Laos making a request for help. And he says, I cannot even today recall Savannah Palma, this is the Prime Minister's wistful plea without a pang of shame. Right? Because this was the quiet war, Americans could very quietly pull out and just pretend like they were never there, right? They didn't necessarily owe anything to these people who died in droves for our insane battle against communism in the jungles of Laos and Vietnam. And yet even Henry Kissinger, this pragmatist, this really kind of sharp-minded academic statesman, even he felt ashamed of what Americans did in this part of the world. And so you fast forward to now, Hmong people were represented in this movie, Gran Torino. All right, so let's get it going. I hit record, so anybody who's totally lost can watch this again. I've given the different groups some resources to try to figure this out. Maybe you could even just Google it, but what is yellow rain? Have we figured this out yet? That's kind of the key question in a way. That's what everybody's interviewing about and arguing about. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So if you couldn't hear her, maybe, well, we'll get into it. But yeah, Lauren summarized it nicely. The episode starts with the uncle's story, right? So what is the uncle's story? Is that there's this poison dust that comes down from the sky, just like Lauren was saying a minute ago. It would get onto people as well as crops. It wasn't even just people, right? It was animals. And it's really a horrifying story. Again, this is the uncle telling the story, translated by his niece, and he clearly like suffered, and people around him were dying, and he was just overwhelmed by what was happening in this village, and it was in the highlands in Laos, in I guess what would have been the late 70s, just after the Americans pulled out from the Vietnam War. And so again, a violent time, a difficult time, all of these mysterious these mysterious yellow rain droppings are coming down and causing all these problems, or so he says. Where's the misunderstanding come in? What is yellow rain really? Because initially they think this must be a chemical weapon. And of course, the Laotian army, the Lao army would not be able to create this chemical weapon. The Vietnamese probably did not create this chemical weapon. It must have been who? Who was the big American enemy in the early 80s? The Russians. And so there were actually pretty major consequences to this, right? Eventually, the Secretary of State under Reagan came out and said this is chemical warfare. And in response, the Americans started to produce chemical weapons. So this wasn't like some small thing. This was a major international incident where the Americans were saying the Russians are using chemical weapons against our former allies over in Laos. We will not stand for this. And so this had major repercussions for American and Russian relationships throughout the early 80s. So okay, that's sort of where we could leave things, but the story doesn't end there, right? What happens next? I guess we come back to this question. What really, I'll use caps very generously, or what really was yellow rain? Did the Russians really create this chemical weapon? It was bee feces. Yeah, so this sort of interesting, let's say, natural phenomenon where bees hibernate over the winter and then they don't poop while they're hibernating, and then they all wake up in the springtime and they all go out in one big mass and they all poop all at once. And the bee poop gives the impression of raindrops. It's like all this polleny, sticky kind of yellow rain, but it's actually just bee poop. Um, and so they took a sample of this bee poop. They brought it to a lab in Minnesota. They said that there were toxins in it. There was a poison in it. They thought it was some kind of sophisticated chemical weapon, but then it turns out that maybe not, right? And maybe it was a contaminated sample. And so there was sort of confusion, and then they walk it back and they're like, actually, this is all just pollen. And they retest the sample and they don't find the chemical weapon inside of the pollen, and it's just really just bee poop. And so it's this kind of bizarre turn where after this kind of major accusation against the Russians and this major response by the Americans, all of a sudden they're like, oh, our bad. It's just bee poop. And so that's kind of the end of the story for Americans. Although the CIA guy that they were interviewing, he said actually yellow rain is still on the books as a type of chemical weapon. And I don't know if our understanding of yellow rain has progressed since this came out in 2012. I think it is not. I think it's still sort of an open question. What the hell happened? And most people tend to think it was just bee poop. And there's a sense sort of like, all right, nothing happened. But then we're still left with Uncle Yang, right? Uncle Yang. What's the deal with him? And so we can kind of begin to discuss this question that I want you to write about. What was the source of the misunderstanding? Why did Cao Kalia Yang become so upset? And why did Robert Krulwich push her so hard? Now we can get a bit more interpretive. We have all the basic facts. So some of you I gave her essay to. Were you guys able to understand any of that? What did she have to say in that essay that I gave to you to look at? I know you're out there somewhere, folks. class is not very interesting if I'm the only one here doing it. I guess Lauren's here. I had my eye on her, but unfortunately, the nature of this hybrid teaching, I've no whip I can crack on you. You know, if you're in the room with me, I can sort of torture you and capture your attention. But hybrid teaching takes away all of my power, all of my ability to coerce all of you. So I hate to say it, but I look forward to the day when hybrid teaching is over. So what's the deal, guys? What was her reaction in the story that I sent you the link to? Did anybody read it? Nothing? Well, it's hard to have a conversation if nobody has a take. It's kind of unfortunate. Lauren, what do you think? She's hurt, right? Why were they hurt?
Because it seemed more like Radio Lab was trying to have a different type of discussion than they wanted to have.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted more of like having that platform to discuss like what the event was to the song. The Radio Lab reporters were more like, well, it wasn't, you know, a dangerous chemical weapon, and they were trying to just like prove that it wasn't instead of like just listening to what the other experience was.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, nicely stated. Yeah, it really came down to that. Exactly. Is the uncle wanted to tell his story, and the Radio Lab folks were actually not.
They weren't that interested in hearing it.
Right. They're interested in one part of his story. Right. They're just like, was it a chemical weapon or was it not? That was the only thing they cared about. Right. Whereas, of course, Uncle Yang, he had a much bigger story he wanted to tell. Right. What sort of things did he want to talk about?
He was talking about the themes of the village. He was talking more about like the suffering that he saw, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a death. Because he was in the middle of it, he got in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And it was just a scary time. What's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, if you can't hear, what Lauren is saying is Uncle wanted to talk about his experiences, right? He was living through this crazy time, just like we talked about. There's major warfare, there's all sorts of bombs happening. So at some point, Cao Liang's like, you guys are thinking about this the wrong way. You're thinking, is this very specific substance being used in this very specific story? And of course, there is a reason we're asking that question, right? Because it leads to this international political incident, right? So I'm not trying to say that the Radio Lab people were totally in the wrong or something. They were just had almost like a scientific question, right? It's like, what specifically was killing all these people? And the uncle's like, dude, people are dying over here, right? Like, what?
It doesn't even matter. Like, I think one of the quotes was like, there were like, you couldn't tell the difference between bombing planes and like,
Right.
planes that were dropping yellow rain.
Exactly. It's like a plane goes by, yellow rain falls, and they're like, did that plane drop the yellow rain? And he's like, maybe they dropped another kind of bomb. I don't know. We were being killed either way. Why don't you care about the fact that people are being slaughtered here, right? Why are we so concerned about bee feces? And so, it's sort of an interesting historical mystery, right? Because, call me crazy, I feel like the uncle's story is pretty compelling. Was he like a reporter? Was he recording exactly what happened? No, he wasn't. But he was saying that people were dying. And it's hard to mistake the death of an animal, right? It's hard to mistake the death of plant life, right? And so, how exactly were animals and plants being killed? We got to trust the guy, right? Why would he make that sort of thing up? Maybe he misremembers the death of an animal. Maybe it was only humans who were dying and it was some sort of other explanation. I don't know, but I tend to trust the guy that it wasn't only humans, that plants and animals were also dying. And, the explanation for that remains sort of a mystery. One reason I find this compelling is because there's not an easy answer, right? And that's why I'm giving you guys space to think about it for homework tonight. There's not an easy answer about what happened. We still don't really know. And all we can really do is think about what happened in this conversation, right? What was Krolwich looking for? And again, I think Lauren and I are sort of exploring that together now. And maybe we haven't quite gotten to this question yet, is what could we do to resolve these misunderstandings? What do you guys think? You know, Krolwich is looking for this very specific kind of scientific story. The Young family are trying to express their own experiences about what happened. How do we reconcile these two different ways of storytelling? How can we resolve this sort of misunderstanding? What do we do? Chat? You guys still alive? And this is an important question because, again, cultural misunderstanding is the name of this book, right? The collision of two cultures. Again, we have this sort of scientific way of approaching the world, thinking about disease in terms of brain malfunction and depakine and blood levels of certain medicines, whereas the Hmong family, they're not thinking about things in that way, right? They're thinking about, these are our experiences. This is how we're living our lives. This is how we're taking care of our daughter. This is what it feels like when she takes the depakine. She has this weird face. She walks in circles. We don't like it when that happens to her. We don't want her to get drunk on these medicines. Maybe we'll give her a little bit, and then we'll try to give her the cupping and the bloodletting and the coin. No, they didn't do the bloodletting. They did the coining and the other sorts of herbs. It's a very similar sort of misunderstanding, let's say, right? It's a very similar set of two cultural norms coming in conflict with each other. Okay, I feel like what's the word? I'm trying to get a response from a place where it's not going to come. So maybe this is enough. Again, Ung Yang is the uncle, Kaukalia Yang is the niece. They talk about the Pathet Lao, which is an ally of the Viet Cong. So it's just the communists in Laos, right? And so they, after the US forces left Southeast Asia in 1975, former allies were viewed with suspicion, right? With frankly good reason. And so then the Hmong were really systematically murdered. I hate to put it so crudely, but that's what happened to them in the late 70s. And so it's funny that, you know, American scientists became so obsessed with this yellow rain, but we're not necessarily so concerned with the Hmong refugees, who, again, it's important to stress, were refugees because of an American war, right? We have such short memories when it comes to these things. And I hate to say, the same thing's going to happen in Afghanistan. The minute the American forces pull out, there's going to be all kinds of former allies who are in trouble. And I hope they fare better than the Hmong did. You know, I hate to say it, but Americans don't have a great track record in taking care of their friends in these sort of situations. So this is kind of the background on Yellow Rain. I won't read it to you. You can read it later if you would like. It basically summarizes the main points of the podcast. This is something you haven't read yet, unless you read it just now when I sent you the link. But the link is here if you'd like to read it. Kaukalia Yang, she actually wrote more than one piece. She's been interviewed a few times. I decided not to give you these just because it would be too much. But Pat and Robert, so those are the Radiolab producers. They introduced themselves. They asked a few questions. Uncle Ung responded to each question. The questions took a turn. The interview became an interrogation. A Harvard scientist said the Yellow Rain Hmong people experience was nothing more than bee defecation. And you can hear this in live time, right? So again, listen to the podcast. It's pretty intense, actually. I encourage you to listen to it. You can hear this turn happen, right? Where the tenor of the conversation moves and you can feel the discomfort in the room, right? It's actually a very powerful moment that you are kind of invited into. And here's Kaukalia Yang's take. She talks about power, right? So what Robert Krolwich is mostly concerned with, the Radiolab folks, what they're mostly thinking about is truth, right? They want the truth. They want the scientific truth. They're looking for kind of quote unquote what really happened, you know, the real truth of the matter. And they're not necessarily so concerned with feelings. This is often kind of what happens in science, right? Is we want the truth and we don't really care what you feel about. Neil deGrasse Tyson makes statements kind of like this, right? He says things like, science is the truth, and it doesn't matter what your opinion is, right? And that's sort of what we're coming up against here, is where the truth is at odds with a man's experience. And we, unfortunately, Krolwich is really ignoring a man's experience in his search for the truth. And it happens to be a particularly traumatic one. So I'll just read it to you. There is a great imbalance of power at play from the get-go. She's talking about the Radiolab people. You got to ask the questions. Robert Krolwich has the gall to say that I quote unquote monopolize. He who gets to ask the questions has control over editing, and in the end, the final word. Only an imperialist white man can say that to a woman of color and call it objectivity or science. I'm not lost on the fact that I'm the only female voice in that story, and in the end, that is my uncle and I who cry as you all laugh on, right? Pretty powerful stuff. And again, she's bringing up these questions of power, of caste, right? To use the language that we have used in this class. And the question remains, right? Would this interview have gone differently if these were not people from Southeast Asia? Let's say they were from Southeast Europe or something like that. Would this be a different sort of conversation? Almost certainly, right? Different cultural situation, different backgrounds. And we can take that same sort of line of inquiry here. I think Fadiman in our book does not actually bring up these questions of power as much. Fadiman is much more polite. I think she's living during a time where people were a bit more polite about these sorts of matters, these questions of power, gender, race, and so on. And Cao Kalia Yang is more eloquent and I think better versed in these sorts of questions here. We don't hear it in the podcast as much. And it really isn't until later, upon much reflection, that the Radiolab people start to change their minds. So actually, Jad Abumrad gave a TED Talk last year where he reflects on this experience. So I'll share this with you. So as you're thinking about, it's actually a very nice TED Talk. I listened to it again just before class, and I forgot how good it was. I'll pause. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking you all to do in this prompt, right? Is how do we resolve these misunderstandings? We have the search for science, the search for truth. And I don't mean to say that that is an illegitimate search. I think that's an important part of why America is so great, why the modern world is so great, right? Not that science only lives in America, right? Absolutely. But at the same time, as Jad was reflecting, there is a truth in human experience. It's not the same kind of truth, it's a different kind of truth, but there is still a truth in it. And so sometimes these are in conflict with each other. And the question is how can we resolve these conflicts? How can we have both truths, right? How can we see with double vision? How can we see the truth of the outsider, the truth of the insider, what is really happening, and then what it feels like for something to happen? So that is effectively what the prompt tonight is asking you to do as well. So anyways, it sounds like you guys have a little work to do, a podcast to listen to, so we can end on that note. Any last questions before we call it a day? How's that sound?
Good.
Good. All right. So where are my buttons? 1 second. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So have a good day, everybody. We can call it there. Let me know if you have any questions about stuff. I'm always happy to talk.